So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I think we have people who where all of those fit to someone or another. And welcome to today's Circle webinar led by Kris Knisely on the Gender Just Language Education Project. My name is Chantal Warner, and together with Beatrice Dupuis, I'm one of the two Circle co-directors. And with me for the webinar today is also Associate Director Kate Mackay. Before we turn to the main event for today, I'm just going to tell you a couple of things about the center and about one of our upcoming events. So for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, Circle is the Center for Educational Resources in Culture, Language, and Literacy. We are a Title VI National Language Resource Center in the College of Humanities at the University of Arizona. And we're supported by the Department of Education here in the US, along with 15 other language resource centers that are in our same grant program. And if you're new to the language resource centers, the LRCs, we all work together in various ways to support the larger mission of language and culture education. And so I want to encourage you after the webinar to check out our joint website. That's the second link that you'll see there. And you'll find a lot of different kinds of resources on that site. Also, please check out Circle's website if you haven't done so already. And our focus is on the intersections between language, culture, and multiple literacies. And on that page, you'll find multiple open educational resources, materials, other events that are coming up. We do have one more event. This is the end of our webinar series for this year, but we have one more event coming up this summer, just around the corner here. And that is the Story as World Making workshop, which will be led by Kathy Short and Duria Klecker. And that is happening June 2nd through 3rd. And this is an in-person workshop, but we do have scholarships for lodging and registration. And we have a few spots, they're going fast, but we have a few spots that are still left open. And the deadline for those is this Friday. So if you're interested in potentially attending that workshop, please do go ahead and follow the link that Kate will be sharing with you here in just a second, or which she just shared with you actually already. And you can go there. There's a short application for scholarships that are for lodging and registration waiver. We'll also be announcing our fall webinar series after the summer, so stay tuned for that. If you haven't done so already, you can join our listserv, or you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and there we'll be posting updates as we continue to shape that and other future events. With that, I'm going to turn to our main event for today, our webinar, and it is my very genuine pleasure to be able to introduce our presenter for today, Dr. Kris Knisely. Kris is a colleague of mine here at the University of Arizona, where he is Assistant Professor of French and Intercultural Competence. He's also affiliated with two other programs, Second Language Acquisition and Teaching, and the Trans Studies Research Cluster. Kris's work examines gender and sexuality in language teaching and learning, and this intersects with areas such as intercultural learning and language ideology, which have been featured in recent webinars. So for those of you who've been following the webinar series, I think you'll see some continuity here. And this is because it involves reflecting on the linguistically and culturally situated ways in which we perceive and embody gender and how these enter into language education and practice. His work and the project that you're going to learn about today also questions how we as language learners and educators can interrogate and upend assumed norms related to gender and sexuality. And Kris's scholarship has appeared in a variety of journals. I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to list them all because we wouldn't have time for the webinar. But for example, Contemporary French Civilization, Foreign Language Annals, the French Review, Gender and Language, and the Journal of Applied Measurement, among others. And he's also an author and developer of a number of open educational resources, which you can find on his website. We'll make sure that link also gets there in the chat. And a lot of these build off of his research on the linguistic practices of trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming speakers of French, but they all provide really valuable models for language educators more broadly. And I would also add they're gorgeously designed, as you'll see the slides, I think, for today are as well. And today, Kris will be talking with us about the Gender Just Language Education Project, benefits, challenges, and strategies for engaging with trans knowledges. So as Kris presents, please do feel free to use the chat for any discussion, or if you have any technical issues or things you want to direct to those of us as organizers. For the presenter, if you have questions that you want Kris to come back to at the end, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. And so with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kris Knisely.
Awesome. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you everyone for being here. It's an absolute pleasure and honor to be with you all today. Without further ado, let's go ahead and kick off what we're here to talk about today. Before I do, I have to thank the Center for Educational Resources in Culture, Language, and Literacy at the University of Arizona, the lovely hosts of today's conversation, for making much of the work that I'll present today possible via their Circle Faculty Research Fellowship. In today's webinar, I'll be presenting the Gender Just Language Education Project. This project entails a collection of research and open educational resources that have been created in order to support language educators in teaching gender inclusive and non-binary language in ways that engage with trans knowledges and are increasingly affirming to trans, non-binary, and other non-cis people. These OERs specifically address the benefits of teaching trans knowledges and linguistic practices, as well as strategies for proactively planning for resistance. To open today's conversation, I want to begin with a reminder that the work of social justice is always necessarily ongoing. There's no end to the process of liberation, and so process and product are always entangled. The idea that equity and justice can be achieved through checklists, toolkits, and examples is a desire that's rooted in whiteness and in normativity. This fact undergirds all of my work as well as our conversation today. The resources I'll share with you are just that, resources. As with any materials, their use alone does not and cannot guarantee gender justice. What they can do is offer supports in your ongoing commitment to and investment in equity and justice, including linguistic justice for trans people. Today is the opening or a continuing of the conversation, a continuation of your investment, and not any sort of a crash course. Before we go further, I also want to make clear that when I use the word trans today, I'm using it in its absolute broadest sense to denote people who flout cis-normative ways of thinking and being. This includes people who do use trans or culturally specific terms such as two-spirit, non-binary people who may or may not self-situate as trans, as well as anyone who refuses to participate in gender modality as a trans-cis dichotomy. These words are always incomplete in their description of human embodiment and ways of being. With these understandings in mind, today we'll open with a brief contextualization of the professional context in which the work of gender just language education and this project in particular intervenes. And then we'll outline what is meant by gender justice in the studies and materials I'll present. We'll be sure to point outwards towards the well-established ethical impetus for gender justice in language education, but we'll focus the core of our conversation on my forthcoming research that demonstrates the potential of trans-affirming queer inquiry-based pedagogies to support students' linguistic development, alongside that of the knowledges, skills, and attitudinal stances that underlie intersectional thinking, intercultural competence, and symbolic competence. I will interweave the available open educational resources throughout the conversation today, but I'll be sure to return to what can be found in this collection and how you might use these OERs in your own sites of teaching and learning at the end of our discussion before we use the rest of the time that we have for talking about the questions and concerns that persist for you. We'll move relatively quickly, so I want to reassure you that all of the information I'm sharing today is available in the white paper at krisknisely.com/planforjustice. I dropped that in the chat, but we'll drop it again later. So let's begin by briefly outlining this professional context. My considerations of the field arise out of my own research and teaching in US context. But given that anti-trans propaganda, legislation, and other forms of oppression are international issues, many of these themes are likely to resonate with many cis-normative global contexts. As a part of a broader social turn, the profession of language education has seen increasing recognition of the importance of pedagogies that engage with students as whole persons writ large. Not only does this attend to the social nature of language and the fact that who we are deeply influences how we approach the processes of language teaching, learning, and use. When pedagogies take into account the fullness of our identities as more than just teachers and learners, we see that students tend to reach higher levels of proficiency, have higher levels of motivation, and experience a wide range of other benefits. Further, it's often the social nature of language that motivates students to engage in and continue with language learning. This turn towards social pedagogies of care has occurred in step with increasing recognition of the need to engage with gender in expansive and inclusive ways on the part of professional organizations and individual language educators for both ethical and interpersonal reasons. Gender is one important part of any such identity engaged in socially focused pedagogy, partly because gender is a social, relational construct whose meanings are always necessarily contextualized and intersectional, and because of the ways that knowing how to use language critically, thoughtfully, and fluently with regard to gender and sexuality is akin to contemporary literacy, given their omnipresence as organizers of social life. These theoretical assertions reverberate with often fraught but increasing public conversations about gender and a growing turn towards trans awareness in education writ large. These points are summarized in this TAQIBP's infographic, which we'll return to shortly in more detail. In keeping with this conceptual frame and in response to the particular concern that exists regarding how to proactively plan for and respond to resistance to trans-affirming language and pedagogies, this project provides a collection of materials that leverage recent research outlining the numerous benefits of teaching trans knowledges and linguistic practices, including those related to intercultural, symbolic, and linguistic competence development, as well as other forms of critical contemporary literacy. These findings extend and support the ethical impetus to teach trans knowledges and linguistic practices, and thus, as we'll outline, can be used to undergird proactive planning for teaching in gender-just ways, as well as for resistance thereto. So let's get into some of this research that allows us to articulate these benefits so that you'll be able to fully use this infographic and draw upon the summaries that are herein once you're in your own sites of teaching and learning. In order to investigate the relationship between gender-just language pedagogies and student development of skills, knowledges, and attitudinal stances that support linguistic, intercultural, symbolic, and intersectional competencies, I studied assignment and assessment data from 112 undergraduate students in the US who were each enrolled in one of 3 iterations of an intermediate French course. Iteration 1 was a control group where translinguistic practices and knowledges were not treated during the 15-week study period. Iteration 2 introduced these topics at mid-semester, and Iteration 3 treated these topics at regular intervals from the first day forward. In Iterations 2 and 3, trans-affirming queer inquiry-based pedagogies, TAQIBPs, were used as a framework for gender-just language teaching. Let's briefly go over the main ideas of TAQIBPs. I'll move rather quickly in the interest of time, but all of the slide text comes from the open access article in which Joshua Paez and I introduced TAQIBPs. And you also have a copy of the infographics that summarize this information in the white paper. So broadly speaking, TAQIBPs entail restive problematizing of all identities and discourses, exposing and interrogating normativity in all of its forms, creating space for marginalized perspectives and identities, and fostering respectful engagement with disparate worldviews. This re-articulation of our relationship to all forms of normativity will serve as important groundwork in proactively planning for how we respond to resistance if and when it does arise. Here, we want to show students that norms are something that we create and collectively negotiate as culturally situated speech communities, and that all classification systems are oversimplifications of our complex realities. We're teaching our students how to ask and always be asking why the world is the way that it is, who benefits from that status quo, how language is involved, and how to imagine alternatives, not just when it comes to gender and sexuality. So what does this look like in real time for our pedagogical goals to make students aware of queer lives and concerns, to introduce the linguistically situated ways that we index and perform identities, to foster critical thinking, to equip students with the linguistic and rhetorical skills needed to advocate for themselves and others, and to make our classrooms more inclusive of students of all genders and sexualities. Perhaps most importantly, we have to explore with and alongside our students, which means we have to forego any urge to perform the role of LGBTQ expert in favor of focusing on a deep, critical, and sustained engagement with queer lives and concerns. This can allow us to at least partially decenter power in the classroom. And in this way, it's an iterative, self-reflective, and co-constructed pedagogy, not any sort of exhaustive knowledge that's needed in order to create conditions for meaningful inclusion and representation. This focus on critical, self-reflective practice for everyone further makes clear that bringing queer and trans knowledges to bear in language classrooms is a continuous, collective responsibility, which cannot be left to community insiders alone. In this process, we have to avoid festivals and foods type multiculturalism. We have to value and normalize the inclusion of trans people in our everyday curriculum. This entails developing critical analytical lenses with our students, where we pick apart and draw attention to how normative discourses silence or obfuscate certain lives. Our avoiding of a so-called trans day and tokenization has to be carried through into our objectives and our assessments. After all, what we assess, what we measure is what ends up being valued. So making trans and queer content visible in our language learning goals demonstrates that queerness, gender, and identity are valued parts of second language learning. It desensationalizes LGBTQ content, and it aids in garnering buy-in. Much resistance is preempted by thoughtfully planning and articulating how and why trans knowledges and ways of languaging are necessarily integral to the processes, objectives, and outcomes of language teaching. That is to say, TAQIBP's focus on bringing queer and trans lives and concerns into clearly articulated learning objectives provides itself a means of proactive planning. Our goal here is not to have any sort of evangelizing mission of changing hearts and minds, but rather to cultivate an inclusive learning community where all students are met with respect and where we actively work together to dismantle marginalization, violence, and oppression without reifying discourses that limit understandings of trans people to that domain. As in the words of Z. Nicolazzo, we may be from oppression, but are not solely constituted of oppression. And so at its most basic level, this implies resisting cisnormativity and assuming that trans people are present, whether we're aware of it or not. Just as visibility alone is not liberatory, we cannot know and need not know someone's existence as trans in order to unscript gender in our pedagogies and curriculum. Any trans-affirming pedagogy must always be trans-affirming. In sum, TAQIBPs represent a collection of dynamic approaches that attend to the ways that gender, gender modality, and sexuality inflect language education, while critiquing all forms of normativity. TAQIBPs vary in their realizations, as all contextually responsive pedagogies by definition must, but they share in intentionally creating space for marginalized perspectives, creating respectful engagement with disparate worldviews, fostering individual agency, respecting a right to self-definition, and increasing LGBTQ awareness. These goals often result in the taking up of particular strategies, such as weaving queer and trans knowledges and ways of languaging into the full breadth and depth of the curriculum, engaging in restive problematizing, that constant questioning I was talking about earlier, and engaging in critical close reading. We also often see attempts to decenter the classroom by collaboratively learning with and alongside students. In the white paper for this project, you'll find 2 infographics that elaborate upon TAQIBPs and some of the ways that these might be realized in sites of language teaching and learning. In addition to these infographics, I have several publications that also present TAQIBPs and the sort of day-to-day classroom moves of choosing instructed forms, crafting syllabi, inviting pronoun sharing, giving assumption mitigated feedback, and so on, which are all linked to in the white paper so that you can continue to work with and think with these materials as you imagine how gender-just pedagogies can be adapted and applied to your own specific contexts. Now that we've have a sort of shared understanding of what I mean when I say gender-just pedagogies, let's return to this benefits infographic so that we can consider what, if any, relationship exists between gender-just pedagogies and student linguistic development. I and a co-researcher explored whether there were any observable patterns in student language error frequency that correlated with instances of gender-just language teaching. whether there were any patterns in specific error types, and whether any influence on the complexity of students' utterances could be observed. Specifically, we iteratively coded grammatical errors by type until we reached consensus. Then I counted the errors and calculated mean error rates for each student on each assignment. I have to note that this calculation of error frequency does allow individuals to use avoidance strategies. So a reduction in error frequency does not always guarantee that additional structures have been mastered. However, successful and purposeful avoidance of structures and forms is a theoretical benefit of learning about the linguistic practices of trans people. Mean length of utterance was also calculated for each participant on each assignment as an indicator of complexity. Using full factorial repeated measures ANOVAs, the patterning of these results regarding accuracy and complexity were then compared to the dates of gender-related interventions that occurred in order to determine what, if any, relationships exist. Results suggested that about 39% of the variance in error rate was related to time. As we might expect, overall, students were more accurate in their utterances as the semester went on. But there was also a significant time group interaction. After stable individual differences in error rate are taken into account, about 6% of the variance in error rate on each assignment was related to course iteration. The highest errors were observed in iteration 1, followed by lower error rates in iteration 2, and the lowest in iteration 3. Taken together, this means that the variation in mean error rates over the repeated measurement occasions is itself varying as a function of treatment group membership, or that there is a statistically significant difference in mean error rates produced over the course of the semester among students who were taught about trans knowledges and linguistic practices, those who only experienced this from mid-semester forward, and those who were not taught about these topics. Herein, treatment of trans knowledges and linguistic practices was related to a reduction in error frequency, both at each time point and overall. As we dig deeper into the data and focus on the main effect of course iteration, the data show that students in iteration 3, so those who had gender just pedagogies the full semester, made an average of 7.5 fewer mistakes per 500 words than those in iteration 1. And that students in iterations 2 and 3 performed better on a wider range of structures, including many that are notoriously challenging at even the highest levels of proficiency. When we compare those to iteration 1, we also see that those in iteration 3 outperformed those in iteration 2. So we see this sort of time effect. Students not only reduce their error rates, but also expand the range of forms and structures on which they successfully produce language forms as a function of how much they've been exposed to gender just pedagogies. So in short, students who learn about trans knowledges and linguistic practices make significantly fewer grammatical and lexical errors as compared to those who do not. A full factorial two-way repeated measures ANOVA was also conducted to evaluate the effects of each iteration of the course on mean length of utterance across time, and there were no statistically significant differences. This means that mean length of utterance doesn't vary in a statistically significant way based on either the effect of time or the effect of course iteration. In short, by these measures, gender just language education yields more accurate utterances without any difference in the complexity of the language that students produce. This finding gives us a major argument for teaching trans knowledges and linguistic practices in sites of language education, extending and reinforcing the existing ethical impetus to do so. And it gives us findings to cite as we respond to forms of resistance. We can tell students that learning these ways of languaging is going to help them in their overall goal to develop their language abilities, even if it's hard, even when they're struggling to identify its relevance. While these findings are critical building blocks in our understanding the full importance and impacts of gender just language pedagogies, we know that linguistic accuracy and complexity are key parts of our goals in language teaching and learning. Our goals also extend far beyond these alone to often include forms of contemporary literacy that hinge on intersectional, intercultural, and symbolic competencies. So let us first consider intersectionality. In this study on intersectional thinking, I asked whether students demonstrate an awareness of intersectionality, whether they engage in intersectional thinking or analysis, and what, if any, relationship exists between gender just practices and the development of these knowledges, attitudinal stances, and skills. In the interest of time, I'm going to primarily focus on this beginning development of intersectional awareness, because there's a traceable arc of development for most participants in this study before any true intersectional analysis appears. But why would I ask if gender just language pedagogy can help teach students to think intersectionally? Well, although careful not to co-opt Black thought or otherwise engage in problematic just-like arguments, TAQIBPs are informed by a rich tradition of culturally relevant pedagogy, intersectionality, and other critical pedagogies and ways of knowing beyond the boundaries of what is acceptable. There can be no trans-affirming or gender-just pedagogy that is not also always concerned with equity and justice as it relates to race, class, sexuality, disability, and all other aspects of identity through which we're positioned in society. In this way, TAQIBPs aim to guide students in thinking with fluidity, flexibility, and complexity, particularly as it relates to language. In following, they offer a potential pedagogical response to persistent calls for increased engagement with intersectionality in language education and its allied fields. And they further represent one of many possible sites for inviting students into considering a collection of the earlier mentioned work on various aspects of selfhood. TAQIBPs and intersectionality also share in pushing back hard delimitations so as to remain responsive to ever-shifting and emerging societal and research needs. However, there is a need to briefly pin down what I mean by intersectionality in this study, particularly considering how intersectionality has become a buzzword in academia, often used with the same illocutionary force as utterances such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, or visibility and representation, which regularly lack the attention to power structures with which intersectionality was conceived. This fact underscores the need to state clearly that I use intersections to talk about intersections of identity, and intersectionality to reference a consideration of intersecting structures of domination, a distinction that'll show up in important ways in the results of this study. The data clearly demonstrate that students are ready to be made aware of intersectionality. However, a unit on identity and language that mentions intersecting positionalities and hierarchies of power does not appear to be adequate for fostering intersectional thinking in most cases. Only one student in iteration 1 explicitly demonstrated an awareness of intersectionality. Gender-just language pedagogies, however, do appear to better support the development of this awareness. 12 students in iteration 2 and 26 students in iteration 3 demonstrated awareness of intersectionality at least one time in their assignments and assessments. There thus appears to be a direct relationship between engagement with TAQIBPs and intersectional thinking. The ways that students engage with questions of positionality and identity across iterations are not only quantitatively different, but they're also qualitatively distinct. In all 3 iterations, there's an element of foundational learning where students develop an awareness of social categories in relationship with language. However, engagement with gender-just pedagogies teaches a different relationship to knowledge through a focus on restively problematizing all identities and discourses, and on exposing and interrogating normativity in all of its forms. This pedagogical focus appears to produce particularities in the ways that students attempt to learn about, contend with, and interrogate forms of diversity and difference. To illustrate, in iteration 1, there's a tendency towards an encyclopedic or facts about diversity approach, wherein students focus on one aspect of selfhood or sociolinguistic variation and provide a list of information acquired. In the example here, we essentially get geographic variation exists, it can be observed in the lexicon and elsewhere. Here is a list of places where French is used. This markedly differs from the ways in which students in iterations 2 and 3 attempt with varying levels of success to recognize and attend to positionality and identity is more than additive, whether it's from an interactional or more intersectional and ecological perspective. In these examples, we see Faye recognizing that linguistic variation isn't limited to geographic variation as she tries to bring in a second axe of social class. And Stephen, through his own positionalities, begins to try and contend with their multiplicity and complexity, often realizing that the French language world is not limited to the various normativities to which students have been exposed through textbooks and curriculum or through broader circulating discourses is an initial and a necessary step for thinking more meaningfully about intersections. That is to say that students must recognize that centering France and Canada to the exclusion of the rest of the French language world is a form of dominance, as is the centering of positionalities that tend to represent dominant or majority groups to the exclusion of those who are made to be minoritized. These realizations may often be limited at first to the intersection of French language use and one other aspect of identity, and students often remark on how obvious diversity was in hindsight. However, these early stages of critical close reading and discussion in TAQIBPS begin to draw attention to how normative discourses obfuscate certain lives and create fertile ground for continuing to develop an awareness of social categories and hierarchies. Part of that developing awareness appears to be recognizing how all people simultaneously occupy multiple positions, which are made to be more or less salient in any given context, even if these realizations are not always linked to interlocking oppressions. This includes noticing that aspects of identity and positionality get communicated explicitly and implicitly via language. This foundational awareness of a multiplicity of identities and positionalities is a necessary prerequisite to being able to think about how they might relate to one another, intersections, and to systems of power, intersectionality. In sum, the vast majority of students do engage in some way with the concept of diversity. The recognition of difference, however, did not always entail more than a single axe approach to recognizing intersections, nor did it always entail recognizing the role of power therein. The data suggests that student attention must be explicitly drawn to the multiplicity and complexity of identities in ways that foster critical thinking, focus on contextual specificity and how identities are indexed, performed, and parsed, and guide students in specifically attending to hierarchies of power as they develop their awareness of these intersections and of intersectionality. TAQIBPs appear to be one viable tool for inviting students to begin to think about intersections and our various ecologies of being and belonging, given the ways that students in iterations 2 and 3 move beyond that sort of festivals and foods type multiculturalism or the encyclopedic diversity of facts approaches that were observed in iteration 1. Although I don't have time to go into detail today, the results for research question 2 often mirrored this pattern, in that students in iteration 1 didn't generally engage with intersections or intersectionality. One student did discuss a multiplicity of identities and contexts on one occasion, but no student in iteration 1 ever really engaged with questions of power. In iterations 2 and 3, there are fledgling attempts at treating intersecting identities and intersecting oppressions. However, those attempts are both more frequent and more often successful in iteration 3 than in iteration 2, suggesting a temporal element to the efficacy of TAQIBPs. In iteration 3, some students began to creep towards intersectional thinking as they contend with context, agency, hierarchies of power, and ways of treating complexity in their analyses. And there's this sort of series of overlapping stages that call to mind other competencies that attend to power, positionality, difference, and disconnection. The results of this study thus offer promising insights into the likely ways that gender-just language pedagogy supports the development of intersectional thinking, which can give us another argument in favor of these pedagogies in our sites of teaching and learning. And they also give us added supports to the ways that we communicate their relevance to our students and to other educational stakeholders. Don't panic, I keep putting these up here, but we're going to come back to them so you'll have a chance to read them. So the findings of this study equally invite the continued exploration of how this may relate to the development of intercultural and symbolic competencies among students in language programs, an invitation that I'd like us to very briefly take up today. So what, if any, relationship could be observed in this study between teaching trans knowledges and linguistic practices and the development of intercultural and symbolic competence. In this study, intercultural competence was operationally defined as an ability and desire to communicate or negotiate symbolic meaning effectively, appropriately, and ethically with diverse individuals and groups whose cultural practices are other than one's own. This deep, ongoing engagement is based on one's critical knowledge, skills, and attitudinal stances, both towards themselves and others, wherein culture is dynamic, heterogeneous, multi-layered, and iteratively performed. Intercultural competence is a never achieved process due to the ways in which culture is inherently socially co-constructed and negotiated in an ongoing way. Intercultural competence requires an understanding of culture as not existing before interactions occur. Culture does not exist a priori, but rather is consistently recreated through interaction and engagement among individuals. The related construct of symbolic competence is more explicitly oriented towards considerations of power, and for this study was operationally defined as the ability to position oneself as a multilingual subject and to manipulate the dimensions of language as a symbolic system, symbolic representation, action, and power. This implies the ability to understand the cultural memories evoked by symbolic systems, to perform and create alternative realities, and to reframe and shape the multilingual game in which one invests. It entails understanding the power game and involves having the knowledge, skills, and attitudinal stances necessary to be able to choose whether or not to act on or challenge power structures, especially as they're reflected in and reinscribed by language. The frequency of code applications across course iterations can provide a global view of the observable patterns in indicators of intercultural competence and any sort of correlations that are there with gender-just language pedagogies. For both intercultural and symbolic competence, the frequency with which codes that positively correlate with competence development were applied increased across course iterations, with iteration 3 having the greatest number of codes applied in each category. These differences were particularly striking in terms of skills and processes that have been shown to correlate with intercultural competence, such as critiquing, questioning, and reflecting on viewpoints, as well as challenging stereotypes. For this code category, average per student code applications in iteration 3 were nearly double those in iteration 1. Sharper yet was the difference in average code applications per student for codes related to attitudinal stances that have been shown to positively correlate with intercultural competence, such as expressing a desire to communicate with others, discussing openness to or experiences of changing attitudes and beliefs, among other examples. Here, average per student code applications in iteration 3 were nearly 2.5 times those in iteration 1. These quantitative trends dovetail with important qualitative differences in the ways that students attempted to contend with cultural, linguistic, and other forms of diversity, and how they thought about their relationship to language, what they wanted as language learners and users. As we saw in the last study in iteration 1, students often took this encyclopedic facts about diversity, facts about language, facts about culture approach, where they list out all of the things that they thought they knew to be true in no uncertain terms. On the same assignment, which asks what they found interesting or important in this course, we see very different kinds of answers in iteration 3. Students discuss awareness and ethical engagement as responsibilities, demonstrating a very different type of attitudinal stance towards linguistic and cultural variation. This student notes, as I get more and more advanced in language, I think it's a responsibility to be fully aware of how our predisposed stereotypes might be affecting how we learn and consider whatever language we're learning or possibly how the language we're learning can shape the way we see various cultures. Here we're starting to see questions of engagement and positionality. This questioning and self-positioning are common themes among student responses from iteration 3, alongside reflections on social co-construction of meaning, of our realities, and of our languages and cultures. These quotes exemplify the shift towards an awareness of developing intercultural competence, an openness to critically questioning the world and to asking questions that don't have easy or perhaps any answers, an openness to grappling with complexity. All of this is present among students in iteration 3, and it's not something we see, not in the same way from students in iteration 1. In the interest of time, I have to move on in order to be able to touch on symbolic competence development. But in short, the data appear to support the assertion that gender-just language pedagogies are a viable tool for student intercultural competence development. As previously mentioned, code applications that correlate with symbolic competence increase across course iterations. This increase was especially marked for codes that involved recognizing, challenging, or otherwise acting upon normativities, or other phenomena that were intertwined with power, privilege, and prestige. Codes of this type were applied more than twice as frequently on average to students in iteration 3 as compared to those in iteration 1. Similar patterns were also observed for code applications related to positioning oneself and others relative to power structures, and those related to challenging such positionings. Qualitatively, we can observe some of the common ways that this plays out. It was difficult to come up with excerpts from iteration 1 because in many ways, the most interesting part of this data was that what wasn't readily present. There was very little engagement with considerations of power overall, and even fewer agentive self-positionings when it came to language as a symbolic system. Of those that did evoke the power game, however, subtly, a vast majority focused on meeting normative expectations to present themselves as good, desirable, permissible, and so on. Using the same prompt in iteration 3 produced starkly different results overall, wherein students are positioning themselves as multilingual subjects, and they're considering whether they have the knowledge, skills, and attitudinal stances necessary to take action on particular power structures or otherwise engage in reframing and shaping their worlds. Collectively, these excerpts illustrate that TAQIBPs can help students to begin to position themselves as multilingual subjects, understanding that language is a symbolic system imbricated with relations of power. We can observe in their utterances the development of particular knowledges, skills, and attitudinal stances that allow them to reflect on their position in these power structures and choose whether or not to act on those structures in and through the language they use. In short, the data appear to support the assertion that gender-just language pedagogies are a viable tool for student symbolic competence development. These findings once again give us additional tools with which to articulate the benefits of gender-just language education and with which to respond to resistance from students, administrators, and other educational stakeholders. To summarize, in and through these related studies, we've seen that including trans knowledges and linguistic practices via gender-just language pedagogies responds to the ethical imperatives to include learners and educators of all genders, provides a foundation for contemporary literacy, which entails an ability to critically, fluidly, flexibly, and intersectionally discuss gender and all other aspects of being and belonging, fosters a more accurate and robust understanding of language as a complex adaptive system, and helps us also to contend with the ways that this inherent variation and change produce rich and complex relations among linguistic co-cultures. We've also seen that gender-just language pedagogies support holistic linguistic competence development through one study that demonstrated that students who learn about trans knowledges and linguistic practices make significantly fewer grammatical and lexical errors as compared to those who do not, without any difference in the complexity of the language they produce. Gender-just language pedagogies can also foster an ability and desire to communicate effectively, appropriately, and ethically with people whose cultures are other than one's own. These pedagogies can further help prepare students to position themselves as multilingual subjects, to advocate for themselves and others, and to otherwise understand, reframe, and manipulate relations of power. We've also seen research that's demonstrated that gender-just pedagogies are a viable tool for increasing students' exposure to, awareness of, and ability to engage in intersectional thinking. In this study, students who learned about gender justice were more than 17 times more likely to demonstrate intersectional awareness than those who did not. It's thus clear that when we allow for complexity in how gender is taken up in and through language, we do not place ethics in competition with student outcomes, but rather in service of them. Much of our discussion today has been guided by and peppered with the open educational resources that are freely available via the Gender Just Language Education Project website. Before we move on to Q&A, however, I want to make sure that we briefly go through what these resources are, where to locate them, etc., so that you're able to continue to work with these materials and adapt them to your own sites of language teaching and learning long after we conclude today. Although you may want to eventually branch out and work with additional OERs that are available on the Resources for Educators tab of my website, all of the resources mentioned today are summarized and contextualized in the white paper that's available at krisknisely.com/plan4justice. We'll throw it in the chat again when we're chatting later. So the white paper will recap much of today's conversation in the overview and the introduction sections, complete with citations that can point you outwards to the related publications, many of which are open access or for which I've provided author shared links. The scope of the project is then summarized in the overview infographic, which you can freely download and share for non-commercial purposes. These infographics are also complete with image descriptions as an accessibility tool when you share them online or with students. The white paper also recounts what we've seen today with regard to the benefits of gender just language education, complete with citations so that you can use this research to support your arguments for gender just language teaching in your specific contexts. This section also gives you a link at which you can freely download a copy of the benefits infographic we've seen today. This is also something that you can share with students, colleagues, administrators, and other educational stakeholders to start or continue conversations about gender just language teaching and learning. As we've discussed today, proactively planning for gender justice in sites of language teaching and learning entails proactively planning for resistance thereto. As trans knowledges and linguistic practices are made increasingly visible, it's likely that individuals will present various degrees of resistance, including normative or transphobic responses. Some of these responses will reflect linguistic conservatism, while others will reflect broader cis-sexist transphobic discourses. We've also seen at the beginning of this presentation how TAQIBPS can provide a framework for this proactive planning, particularly because of the ways that it asks us to thoughtfully plan and articulate how and why trans knowledges and ways of languaging are necessarily integral to the processes, objectives, outcomes, and language and so forth of language teaching and learning. And because it articulates these responses within a broader resistance to normativity in all of its forms. Consider, for example, how articulating the importance of linguistic, intercultural, intersectional, symbolic, and other competencies as they interface with LGBTQ topics can help to guard against stakeholders who might question the importance of queer and trans inclusivity, as it's much harder to resist educational topics and methods that have been clearly argumented for than those whose importance remains fuzzy or entirely unarticulated. The work of proactively planning for resistance necessarily requires familiarity with one's own contextual affordances and constraints. In keeping, this work has to begin with and regularly return to critical self-reflection about our own knowledges, practices, and attitudinal stances, as well as those of our colleagues, administrators, students, and the communities in which we find ourselves, including as these attitudes are reflected in institutional discourses and policies. This also means that feedback structures are necessary so that instructors can sort of take the pulse of their classrooms and explicitly address resistance and phobia as they arise. This self and contextual understanding is critical for being able to build internal and external coalitions and for being able to anticipate possible forms and sources of resistance while we build structures that guard against them. The white paper will point you outwards toward Knisely and Paez 2021, which offers a self-inventory to help you begin this critical self-reflection, as well as guiding questions to use with students, among other resources. Much resistance is mitigated by proactive planning and efforts framed by gender just pedagogies. In fact, although it's likely to vary by context, it's been my personal experience that student pushback is fairly rare when TAQIBPs are followed. This statement is not made to minimize the very real forms of pushback that do occur, but rather in an effort to not overemphasize or stoke common fears of disruptive resistance when we discuss proactive planning. However, true, we have to also be prepared for when students, colleagues, and administrators' resistance to gender justice persists in spite of the proactive planning that we've undertaken in line with TAQIBPS. Here, contextual understanding allows us to individually and collaboratively craft responses to resistance that are locally fitting and aligned with the broader goals of gender just pedagogies, which, as we talked about earlier, is not a mission of changing hearts and minds, but one of moving the needle of understanding and acceptance from disengagement and discomfort to a fuller, more respectful engagement. As with all aspects of TAQIBPs, what works in one context won't necessarily work in another. And in keeping, the white paper includes a list of starting ideas for potential responses to forms of resistance that figure in the discursive landscape of inclusive, trans, and non-binary ways of languaging, which can all be adapted to your own particular context. For example, when someone remarks that these ways of languaging are made up, the white paper offers a possible script for reminding them that all language is made up, that language is a complex, adaptive system that entails variation and change. When someone expresses disagreement or disbelief, the white paper offers a potential script for reminding your interlocutor that this is about mutual respect and not a question of agreeing or disagreeing, not a question of belief, because people's existence isn't open to our opinions in that kind of way. When someone states who they are, it's not a question, it's a statement, and often it's an indication of a boundary. This is about learning to engage ethically and appropriately with people whose realities may differ from our own. Intercultural competence, and about cultivating the kind of contemporary literacy that this requires. Ideas are also offered for how we break down restrictive and prescriptive ideas about correctness, fears about confusion, mistakes, and difficulty, appeals to so-called language authorities, as well as questions about utility and relevance, be it related to the fact that these forms and linguistic strategies are not always used by all members of all of the linguistic co-cultures of the languages we teach, or broader applicability to the process of language teaching and learning. Here too, the white paper includes a download link so that you can use this section with your students, administrators, and other interlocutors as needed. As we all necessarily vary in our level of familiarity with gender-just language pedagogies and linguistic practices, the white paper also includes numerous pedagogical resources, including the downloadable infographics I mentioned earlier today, which summarize TAQIBPs and offer examples for applying them in the day-to-day of classroom teaching and learning. Linguistic resources are also provided for French, including an infographic intended for use with students that summarizes direct and indirect language strategies for encoding non-binary experiences of the world into French, as well as related handouts, some of which focus on written communication and a more restricted set of language forms, and others of which focus on discursive strategies that are applicable to oral communication and offer an alternative or expanded presentation of what's included on that 6x9 summary card I first showed. Following these infographics, the white paper closes with a big picture presentation of this project as one that's ongoing, research-based, and pedagogically and linguistically engaged, followed by a complete works cited and notes about the licensing and funding of this project, hat tip to Circle. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and conclude today's presentation so that we have plenty of time to discuss your interests, questions, and concerns. So thank you again for being here today, and I look forward to beginning Q&A together.
Thank you so much, Kris. So we do have a few questions that have already popped up, and please do feel free to keep adding to those. I want to capture, I saw someone earlier had noted how wonderful these findings are, and I will echo that, and people saying this is impressive work and general excitement. So I want to make sure to capture that first. I'm actually going to start with Julia's question here. Kris, how do you pronounce your last name?
It's Knisely. I'm sorry. It's Knisely.
It's Knisely. I made it German. So
it was Pennsylvania Dutch at one time, so German's right about there.
There you go. All right. I thought that would be a good one to start with. And then we have a couple of questions that are asking you to circle back to concepts that you talked about already. So one is the question of restive problematizing. If you could just talk a little bit more about what that is and how you understand that in language education.
Absolutely. I think a really good resource on that is Cynthia Nelson's work, and that's linked to in the white paper. I think it's 2001, but the white paper will tell you the year for sure. And so sort of building off of her idea, I think about restive problematizing as developing this habit of always asking questions, right? Of learning to approach the world around us as something that we're going to necessarily try to analyze, and not just sort of taking the status quo for what it is. So for me, how we get at that with students are those guiding questions that I presented you in the yellow box, right? That what is the status quo? Why is it this way? Who benefits? Who's marginalized? How is language involved in this? And what alternatives exist? So for me, I think of restive problematizing as sort of always having those questions spinning in the back of my mind anytime I look at a new document, engage with any sort of media, engage with different people. Hopefully that helps to be clearer about what I mean by restive problematizing, but if it's not, please circle back and I will continue the word salad.
No, thank you so much. That's a new concept to me. I think it's really helpful as a tool to think with. The other one that came up was symbolic competence. If you could talk a little bit more about how you understand that in relation to the project.
Totally. So I'm going to go and share my screen again, just to pull us back to the definition for anyone who wants to screenshot it, though it is also in the white paper. For me, I think about symbolic competence as really being about power, right? More than anything else, to me, it's trying to think about and understand how power plays out in all of our interactions, right? And so for me, it's tightly linked to language. There's more that we're doing when we're languaging than referencing something, right? We're not just having this sort of, I package a piece of information that makes references to objects in the world, and then I send that container through a conduit off to you, and you unbox it, and you do your YouTube video unboxing. No, you unbox that information, and then you understand something clear and concrete. When we're languaging with people, we're really trying to negotiate how this fits into bigger systems of meaning, bigger systems of reference, and in all of that, all of these hierarchies of power that exist, right? Because anytime that we're engaging with someone, power is always there. So for me, working with symbolic competence with students is really important, because I think that it sort of takes much of what we're getting at with intercultural competence and says, but this is not sort of neutral forms of difference. These are not sort of easy pieces to sort of say, I get this, I get that. It really introduces students the idea that they're acting on systems, they're parts of systems. And anytime that they choose to do language, they're either choosing not to question any of those systems of power, or to flout the norms and expectations that are there and to try to push back against those systems of power. So for me, it's really important that students start to learn to think about themselves as more than language users, but agentive language co-creators, I guess, that they're reshaping their world as they use language. So hopefully that sort of gets at it. And one more thing before I stop circling the drain here. I think it's especially important when we're talking about gender just language pedagogies, because we know that in many of the languages we teach, trans and non-binary ways of languaging are marked ways of languaging, right? They tend to be ways of languaging that are not made to be powerful. And so if students can think about symbolic competence in other contexts, it gives them a sort of foundation and preparation for thinking about, what am I going to do and how do I respond when someone tells me I'm languaging wrong, right? They get to say, hold on, slow down. I get that these aren't standard fitting to standard language ideologies. I get that this isn't the language that you view as powerful and prestigious, but it's the language I'm using. And then symbolic competence gives them sort of these beginning scripts for how to push back and how to decide when it's not safe to push back as well. So for me, that's how it really locks in with questions of gender and language.
I think that's a really helpful reminder too, that not engaging in inquiry is also a choice rather than the lack of a choice, and that has effects with regards to those systems as well.
And I think it's helpful for them to realize that there is no neutral, that neutral is itself a choice.
Yeah.
And that they're always positioned. I'm really glad you sort of took the highlighter to that thought that was back here.
There's a couple of questions. I'm gonna link them together, and then if I miss anything in specific that anyone wanted to get in there, just let me know. But there are a couple of questions that have to relate to when people are teaching in contexts and settings, which themselves might not be supportive of, or even be honestly belligerent towards trans affirming pedagogies, either in one instance because of a religious community or because of deeply entrenched cultural traditions. You already talked about that a little bit in regard to institutions. Can you just say a little bit more about that, if you have kind of tips for anyone, or ways to think into that problem?
Yeah, I think I have sort of a two-parter response about what do we do when we find ourselves in a site of teaching and learning or a broader community that is less open to these sort of shifts in ways of being and ways of languaging. And for the first part of that, I think this is why I would argue that gender just pedagogies and TAQIBPs are so important, because if you're not focusing only on gender, you can often ease past a lot of the things that would be trigger points or pressure points with the people you're interacting with, right? If we are able to sort of think about normativity broadly, and gender is one example among many, it doesn't tend to incite quite the same level of resistance as if you were to focus on trans day, non-binary day, gay day, queer day, as these sort of cultural cutouts where we're 100% focused on just this. If we're sort of weaving things about gender and sexuality into all of the work we're doing, and they're coming up in smaller ways, it's harder to sort of elicit a big response to something as small as a mention here or a mention there. And yet that consistency does the work of opening up possibilities. For that, I would tell you that Joshua Payaz has some really interesting work on queering language classrooms in their, I think it's a 2021 book. It's linked to in the white paper as well. And I think that some of the ways that they think about sexuality and easing past sexuality with local examples and work that's deeply rooted in objectives really parallels with a lot of what I write about in TAQIBPs, with we're not just focused on gender and sexuality, we're focused on this broader shift in opening up possibilities for being and languaging. So that would be my sort of one side And the other side is we can also think carefully about what examples and what small shifts we pick first, right? So Artemis Lopez in their work talks about direct versus indirect non-binary language. And I would say that a lot of times people are more scared to use these direct forms, these specific forms that are going to clearly mark, hey, something's going on with gender here that is not masculine, it's not feminine, something else is going on with gender. We're doing something that's non-binary or that's otherwise not sort of this classical restricted understanding of binary gender. And I think it's understandable to have those feelings. I think that there are some people for whom there are contexts where it's dangerous to deal with direct non-binary language. I would encourage people to really, really question how much it is your fear and how much it is a site where it's really not possible. Because I think there's some teasing out to be done between what our fears are as educators versus where it's really presents physical and corporal danger to people to begin to do this. But that doesn't present us the impossibility of dealing with indirect non-binary language. I can still teach students how to avoid structures and forms. And the students in my class who need this can still pick up on ways of languaging about themselves and each other that work better for them than binary forms if that's what they're needing. So I think we have to try to push back as much as we can, because I think many of us are in positions of substantially more power with this than we like to believe or that we feel ourselves to be in. But I think there's also ways to sort of take small steps and get yourself comfortable and test the waters and talk to colleagues to see who you might be able to form coalitions with and build groups of people who are willing to slowly but surely add on these pieces and get into it. So without knowing your exact specific context and being able to speak to sort of the exact specific ways of strategizing about that context, that would be my sort of general brief, is think strategically and also push yourself to do something, because slowly building some things eventually give us something that begins to look like the starting bit of a path towards gender justice. So that's where I'd start.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to pull in here a couple of comments just in case you had anything more to say about that are recognizing on the one hand that this kind of work could create other kinds of gender justice as well, that it has a broader positive effect. But then also with a particular example of a religious community, that you can also have people who are identify as proudly feminist, as racially inclusive, as progressive, and still have resistance to, will have a gender barrier is the way it's described here, or have a resistance to trans affirming approaches. I don't know if there's anything you would add to what you already said regarding that.
Yeah, I mean, I think with regard to the first comment about how this is applicable to more than trans and non-binary linguistic justice alone, is that all of our liberation is intertwined, right? All justice is intertwined. For me, that's why I try to talk about the fact that I'm not trying to co-opt from other traditions. I'm trying to very actively not co-opt other traditions. But when I talk about gender just pedagogies, it has to reverberate with other efforts towards social justice. If it doesn't, we're taking a really narrow idea of who we are in the world and what it means to think about positionality and identity and social connection and hierarchies of power. We necessarily have to deal with other forms of being and belonging, as I sort of mentioned in the talk. As far as the sort of second group of comments of openness to one set of marked or marginalized ways of being in the world does not necessarily indicate openness to another. I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think a lot of times people like to think of this as interpersonal niceness, and that's not what it is, right? There's a foundation of being caring and being nice to one another, but it's really about opening up ways of thinking and being, and because we find openness in one area does not necessarily mean that it's going to be there in other areas, which sort of circles back to the first point of what I'm saying, where it has to all be connected, because otherwise we end up with these pockets of advocacy for certain ways of being that exclude others, and none of us really gets any closer to equity, justice, and liberation in doing that. I think if we do that, we really rob us all of a world where we can exist more fully and more meaningfully, and all of those words that are not coming to my brain. So those are sort of my responses to that. If you want to hear me ramble on about disconnections for about 30 pages, it is my chapter in a book by Josh Piaz and James Coda that's linked in the white paper as well, where I talk about disconnections between sexuality and gender and how that's created tensions, and how we really lose in our thinking if we don't think them together, and if we don't try to think with multiple positionalities at the same time, or at least cycle through them and then come together to think together.
That's a good reminder too. And Kate put the link in there. I think looking at the bibliography of that white paper is a great way to get started with reading. I want to make sure to bring this question in, because I do think for some people for whom this is a wholly new concept, or an almost new concept, and are just trying to figure out even what gender just language use looks like. Do you have a quick example you could give in English, or kind of that's accessible to English speaking audience, that just captures what that is?
Yeah. So at a very, very basic level, the first thing I'd say is, let's think about pronoun use. We don't need to use he, she language, right? A lot of times I'll say, when you're writing your syllabus, don't do that he/she. Instead, write directly to the students. And then even if you're not quite ready to do the sort of unknown interlocutor they, right? Which doesn't play out quite the same as non-binary they, but that's neither here nor there. That way, you are using the first person in English where there is not required gendering. So that would be a very simple way that I'd say start to think about it. A sort of next way is, when you're teaching language forms, you often are probably writing out verb charts that goes he, this, or well, I guess in languages that mark for gender in pronouns and verbs, you're probably writing he/she and then the verb form. But you could easily add in he/she/they, and then if you're teaching English neopronouns like ze, I would say when they come up, try to put them there. Another thing is, who are you teaching about, right? Even if you're not dealing with gender directly, there are gendered messages that you're giving based on the images that you choose, the examples that you choose. And so also doing that rest of problematizing yourself, asking, who am I representing here? What does that make it seem like in whatever I'm talking about? So those would be 3 quick ways that I would say to start thinking about it. If you want to think about it more deeply, you've got those 2 infographics in the white paper, and you also have my chapter in the DDFC volume, where I go and I talk you through every decision I made in setting up one of my intermediate courses. So I talked you through, how did I pick my, like, what do we think about syllabi language? What about like policies? What policies does this relate to? What do I do on the first day? Because I want to open this up, but now I heard you say in talk once that we shouldn't force people to tell us our pronouns, and now I don't know what to do anymore. I thought I was being inclusive, and am I messing it up? So I talk you through all of the things that I chose to do in my class and the rationale behind those, all the way through, oh no, I opened the textbook and I found a really binary, exclusionary exercise, but maybe I don't have the choice to just throw it out and get a new one. This is the textbook I have, or I have no materials. What do I do? How do I make that better very quickly and use it as a possibility for opening up ways of languaging, instead of an eek moment where I sort of apologize for the textbook and don't know what to do. So that would be another thing. And the link makes it so that it is open access to you, even if it is not technically open access.
You're already anticipating and moving into the next question that I was going to ask, which is about the specific instructional strategies and moves that you would suggest. I think you already pointed us towards the infographics as a starting place. And I can share, you were kind enough to share those with me, and I adapted them for the instructors I work with, and they found them really helpful. But there was also the question of, can you give an example of a specific material which you would use to apply the TAQIPBs? Or I think in general, people are really intrigued by this idea and are wanting a little bit of an illustration of what that looks like.
Totally, I can do that. I am going to use visuals because I will be more concentrated if I take you to them here. So on that second infographic here that we get, I give you like 4 examples of things that I do in editing sort of my textbook. So if I were to see in a textbook, sort of an introduction of, hello, sir, hello, ma'am, I would think, oh no, I've got a textbook that's super binary here. What do I need to do? Well, I'd start by inviting a reflection with my students. I'd invite them to do those restive problematizing pieces right with me and say, well, what's going on here that needs to be called out? Because there's something going on here that's really maintaining a status quo that excludes non-binary people. And then at a minimum, I'd sort of hide those. Well, we can just say hello. If we have no idea what else to do in the language we're teaching, at a bare minimum, we can start with omission. Even better if we can find ways that non-binary people and trans people are using language to represent more than this sort of masculine and feminine duality, we can add that in. So in French, it'd be bonjour madame, bonjour mix. In English, we would probably just say hello, and then if we needed an article for someone, or an honorific for someone, it's also often mixed, but there are a few other options. When I come into a language that has grammatical gender, I would question why we're setting up these categories of masculine, feminine, and what does grammatical gender even mean, so that we can really trouble this relationship between language forms and sort of social gender. Not to suggest that it's not related and we can throw it out like some of the academies like to suggest, because that's not true, right? What we do in our mind connects them. But to remind students that they're not necessarily the same thing. We've made these connections in our minds and we have these references that go back to it, but it's not hard and fast fact, right? And we can open that up and think about what other possibilities exist. And so in doing that, then I would say, well, why do we label it masculine and feminine? Why wouldn't we label it something like catégorie 1, catégorie 1, or whatever the non-contracting definitive articles are in the language that you're teaching, if you're teaching one with grammatical gender. Now, if you don't have a language where gender is regularly marked, it's not going to make sense to ask your students for pronouns an agreement on every assignment. So we don't need to have this sort of obsessive fixation on it where it's not necessary and it's not helpful, right? If I'm teaching English, I'm not going to ask my students for their pronouns in every assignment because they're not going to mark for gender when they're writing in the first person. But if I'm teaching one where they are, I can invite that so that I can tell students, look, if you want to provide this information, that way I'm less likely to make assumptions that aren't going to help me when I'm giving you feedback. Let me try to temporarily pin this down for you just for this assignment so that what you're trying to do with language and the feedback I'm giving you to help you get towards what you're trying to do come together. So those are some little starting ideas I would sort of pull together for you. Hopefully those were examples that work in the minds of the many languages we have represented. Languages don't have minds. In the many people, in the languages that are taught by the many people, yes, you all with me, I hope. Whew, it's getting rough, though I'm sure for some of you it's like 3 o'clock in the morning.
I do want to come back to the question of languages because there's an important question here, but just real quick, because the example brought up a couple of thoughts that I want to capture of people noting that walking through this example, that it really showed how this relates back to symbolic competence and why this is something that you're advocating as something for the whole class and for all students, and it's not just a set of pronouns that you introduce if you happen to have a student in the classroom who's identifying with them, but rather that this is an inquiry-based approach, as you were saying, right? That that is valuable for everybody. And Sandra had a question related to that I'll go ahead and pull in here because it relates, which is just about how do you scaffold that? Are you code switching? Are you using both English and French, or how do you approach those kinds of conversations, especially in the beginning level classes?
So oftentimes I lead it with my examples on the board, and I just sort of accept that students are in general feeling a bit uncomfortable, a bit lost, and that their learning to sit in that discomfort and confusion is going to be good for them far beyond questions of introducing gender just practices. And so on the first days, I sort of let them sit with the what in the world is going on. But after that first class, I'll often send an email to students that says something like, so today we introduced each other. You may have noticed that I kept using the word non-binaire, and then sort of explain what that means, and use communication in both the language of study and the student's language, if they have a common language that I can use. Sort of in outside of class time, I do a lot of explaining in English and in French, scaffolding upwards. But in class, I stick to the language of study and just try to introduce little bit by little bit, right? So if I write il, elle, yel in a list of pronouns before a verb, and the first time I sort of put in parentheses non-binaire after yel, it's close enough that they can figure it out. So I may have some great fortune based on the similarity that exists between French and English, and that being the language I teach and the language of most of my students. But I think it's okay to let students be unsure, because I think it's good for them to learn that tolerance of ambiguity early on and to learn to come to you and ask questions. And really, trans ways of languaging and transcultural practices lean into ambiguity and multiplicity. And so teaching them that is something that I think is not only not a problem, I think it's actually valuable to offer them supports when they need it, but not to shy away from those sorts of moments of confusion. I wanted to, as we were talking here and as you're asking these questions, it also made me think there are a couple of presentations on my website that you can access anytime you like that goes through specifically language forms in French. And then the other one really walks through these concrete examples of what do I do in each class. So if you're less into reading chapters and more into listening to videos, that's another place that you can continue to get me to elaborate on what I do here. But I think take the other ways that you know about scaffolding and apply those to these forms. How would you introduce other forms and structures that might introduce confusion? I think much of what you do in the classroom already is applicable here. I think there's often a bit of nervousness and concern that we'll get it wrong. And I think there's value in making sure that you get the information you can and be attentive and be self-reflective to try to improve your approach. But at the same time, I think we also tend to forget how much we already know as language educators about how to introduce new forms, new concepts. So I think lean into that as well. I don't know if I fully answered the question. Hopefully I did.
I think you absolutely did. And then, yes, Sandra's confirming. I have this question that I want to pull in here because I know it's something you've thought about. It's something we've talked about. And that's when you're wanting to introduce third gender or non-binary pronouns and aspects of language, but in a language where maybe the communities who use those, where that hasn't been a discussion that's sort of been picked up outside of those communities necessarily. And therefore, there's not kind of a more publicly recognized set of those as there might be in languages such as English and perhaps French. So the example here is Arabic, where there's not a visible public discussion about trans language, and where it might even be difficult to figure out exactly how you should teach those, what are the strategies that are being used in those communities. If you have any ideas about how a person can start to find their way in there.
Mm-hmm. I definitely do. I think this is a very common challenge because even in French, where it's now there's at least one form that is used by non-binary people that is in a dictionary, even if it's not quite fully recognized as such. Even still in a language where there's that kind of growing awareness, there's still plenty of people who say, that's not French, it doesn't exist, I've never heard of it. But my question to people who say that doesn't exist is, how many trans and non-binary people are you close to and languaging with? And I say close to because just knowing trans and non-binary people doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get that sort of openness, right? You have, I think about like communities of practice and the idea of this sort of peripheral participation. So looking on social media and queer and trans publications, that's a first place that you might start to encounter these ways of languaging. And there might not be specific forms, especially in contexts where it might still be dangerous to use these regularly, right? There you might find a lot more indirect ways of languaging that sort of hint at or allow for non-binarity to exist. And so I'd start peripherally participating there. And as you grow and build connections, it's likely that you'll begin to have access to linguistic practices that you didn't have access to before, that were very restricted in these communities. So I think there's something to be said for that. And some of what I suggest in my writing, when you've tried to do this, you can't really find the forms, you can't really find publications, you have no idea where to start, is to invite your students into that with you. Because that's part of what gender just pedagogies is, right? Saying, I don't have all the answers, but this is important. So I've got this starting list of hashtags or usernames or keywords or something to start you going out on the internet or on social media to see what you can find in publicly available forums. And now let's see what we can discover together. I also have a tendency to try to hope that we'll be able to find something existing in community and build off of that. But I think where there's not, there's also the option to discuss with your students, well, this is our language community, and we also get to create a linguistic co-culture. And in doing that, we have the option to find ways that work for us. So if pronouns are the big sort of sticking point in your language, maybe you want to borrow the concept of proper pronouns from, why am I blanking? It will come back to me who did that. But there's someone who wrote about this idea of proper pronouns. So if my name, there we go, Kiki Kosnick and colleague whose name I forgot. But so Kiki writes that, like, for them, their pronoun, for Ki's pronoun is he. So a shortened part of their name. That's something that you might borrow from and explore with students. So I think there's nothing wrong with helping students realize that language is in movement and language is always multiple. And let's go see what we can find in communities that use the language that we're learning. And then if we don't find something that works for us, let's build a linguistic community where we find ways of languaging that do work for us. And to sort of help you in going out and getting into these sort of communities to which you and your students don't always belong, I have an infographic on my website that sort of gives you some starting principles so that you can talk to students about, okay, we're going to go out and we're going to do this web quest, but we have to be careful about what we're doing too, right? It's not the job of these people on the internet to educate us because they didn't choose to be advocates and educators on their social media feed. We're trying to learn, but we need some sort of ethical guidelines around that. So that's there to help you in doing some of that. Yes, that is where I would start.
I'm seeing gratitude expressed for that people are finding that really helpful. People have asked about the recording. Everyone's wanting to go back and watch it 6 times at least, it sounded like. And so we will be sharing that out. Kate posted the poll and both that and the open-ended survey that we use for feedback. Please do complete those if you can. They're incredibly helpful feedback for us, but they also help us to continue to advocate for funding for events and projects such as this. And so I just want to finish again by thanking you all for being here, and thank you, Kris, so much. We'll make sure that the chat gets shared with Kris so that that we don't miss any of the nice praises and the thank yous that are coming in there. And with that, please join me. I will speak on behalf of all of us in saying how wonderful and how helpful this is.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you all were able to join. I am so glad for everyone who will watch the recording later. Share this with your students, with your colleagues, whoever you think could benefit from it. That's what it's really about. So thank you for being here. Thank you to Circle, making this possible, getting us all together. I'm grateful to you all. So thank you for joining.
And I'll give people a second to log off. And while I'm doing that, I'll tell you, students in our 4th semester class in a project this semester did in fact do that. They created their own pronouns for the ones that were missing and then used them consistently and created their own grammar for it. So
that's awesome. I mean,
yeah.
I think it's great when we work with like language data from communities, but I also think it's great when we give students agency to develop languaging that works for them, because I think it really helps them better understand what language really is, right? And break out of this sort of all knowledge is contained in my textbook, and anything that is not in my textbook or my dictionary must not exist and cannot be correct and cannot be used. And language becomes so much more fun when you realize that it's about the social. It's about this constant evolution, and it's something to play with. And yeah, I could ramble on forever, but I'm so glad that they did that. That's lovely.
Please do go read the white paper, everyone. And yeah, have a lovely morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are.